Chapter 6. Montgomery was exhausted from the sleepless nights and the lifeless days, exhausted from everything that was his life. He slept for a few wondrous hours before a loud reverberating hum from the intercom tried to wake him to fulfill Keller's deal. Dimly he sensed drool pooling out of his mouth and onto the mattress. But instead of waking up to a filthy cot, he clung to his dream for a minute longer. It was a summer day back home in the West Dominants. The sun cast golden light onto the street, while he walked down a sidewalk through town square, making his way homeward. Cotton bits, like tufts of clouds, flowed through the air in a snowy, lazy manner. The sight struck him with power, more than seemed possible. How could cotton bits flying through the air imprint themselves upon him so powerfully? The image of an atmosphere floating with cotton bits had been tucked away, frozen and forgotten, somewhere in the furthest recesses of his mind. He didn't remember the last time he had seen or even thought about such a phenomenon. It was like re-entering the home of his adolescence again after decades of absence. The forgotten thing, cotton falling and drifting, swirling through the air, bringing a sweet smell and life-filled air, rocketed to the front of his mind and was once again. And all he could do was stand in awe, until the dream ended and he was back on his ratty mattress with crusty drool in the side of his mouth and a throbbing pain in his ear and arm. The voice told him it was time. Moisture collected on the outside of the windows as the car rumbled through what was unmistakably old London. Cabs, buses, and pedestrians hovered in a fog-drenched miasma of cracked sidewalks, narrow streets, and weathered buildings. "Keller?" said the man sitting next to Montgomery. Montgomery turned to look at him. He had a large nose, tufts of grayish hair on his head, and a set of slightly tinted spectacles. He appeared and sounded perpetually unhappy. "Get used to being called that, please." "Yes, sir," answered Montgomery, worried about what else he should prepare to get used to. Being soul-caged in a real body was not a wholly new experience for Montgomery, but the last time it had happened was so far removed from now that this experience was renewed and remarkable. He could feel so much more, with countless more receptors than any droid could replicate. It was amazing. It also felt distinctly wrong. Being in a body other than his own felt gross, invasive, disgusting even. Fatty parts of the body, he really couldn't think of it as his body. That wouldn't normally have bothered him, seemed uglier than anything. The hair on his face felt abominable and itchy. His teeth and tongue and the taste of his own saliva were all repulsive. And of course, worst of all was the faint feeling of the sickness that had wiped Keller himself out enough to prevent him from being able to attend this gala without Montgomery's help. Even with Keller's body's pain dulled, Montgomery now understood why he was so keen on getting a bit of extra mental rest. His head was bursting with dull pain, his throat full of garbage. This social event must have been truly significant for Keller's career to warrant such a drastic move as this. Oddest out of anything in this experience, so far as at least, was the fact that Montgomery thought he could sense Keller himself, the real Keller, deep within their shared mind. Keller was asleep, gratefully and peacefully, but Montgomery could feel him there nonetheless, like they were tied together. He wondered if he would even have noticed him if he hadn't known to look for him. "You have a seat with the lords this evening," said the large-nosed man, adjusting his lapels, "near the king." "The king?" Montgomery's eyes bulged. "The king of Greater Europa himself." The thought of killing the king the first chance he got instantly flashed through his mind. It came without prompting, a natural reflex at this point, a thought he hated but trusted in. Europa equals enemy. When the car stopped in front of the building, Montgomery stepped out of the car, wobbling on his unfamiliar pudgy feet and breathing out of his nose onto his mustache. He looked up and gaped. He expected an old building of Roman style or some such, but what he found was decidedly modern. Almost half of the face of the 4- or 5-story building, that which wasn't solid deep gray stone, was great sheets of solid glass. Banners representing each of the provinces of Greater Europa were strewn behind and in front of the glass. An enormous crowd of men and women in fine dress was filing their way up the stairway, in through the front doors. People, dozens and dozens of them. "Can you hear me, Keller?" The voice came from the device in his ear. He gratefully shook his attention away from the people and responded, "Yes." "Good. You'll be following my orders. Remember that." Absently, Montgomery didn't respond for a moment. "Keller, respond affirmative if you understand." "Yes, I understand." "Good. Can you recite your full name, Keller?" The name came to him in pieces. "It's Adrian, Willard Keller." the second. 2 handlers came by his side and nodded to him, Large Nose and another man with a fairly obvious scar on his forehead and milky-looking eyes. The air was crisp and cool. There were clouds all in the sky, so he was ready to get inside and begin talking to people. This is a chance, Montgomery thought, to learn how to be charming for Willow, to keep things between us going as long as possible. But why did he care about that, he wondered. Although he had attempted to be genuine during their time together, that didn't change the nature of the falsehood that was their relationship. By attempting to deepen that bond, he was only deceiving her, actively tricking her. What sort of relationship was that? They led him up the steps. He got a good look at the people around him. Tall people, short people, dark-colored people, light-colored people, wide people, and thin people. And many of them would know who Keller was. Montgomery felt the dull throb of sickness in his head, tried to shake it away with a breath of fresh, foggy air. They passed through the doors. Through the turning halls they wove, directed by various servers in black vests and aprons, until they found their way to a ballroom. Countless tables littered the wide room, many of them yet to be filled. In the center of the room was an enormous crystalline fountain spouting water in jets of liquid, and even mist. From the ceiling hung chandeliers and modern light fixtures and expensive party streamers. Balconies housing lords and barons decorated the walls alongside ancient tapestries, a strangely perfect blend of old and new. "You're over here, Keller," said Large Nose. He hadn't bothered giving Montgomery a name. He got the feeling Large Nose didn't trust him. "Can you remember Lady Wensongale?" asked Scar. I don't know," Montgomery said. His voice sounded so odd, like he was doing a cartoonish accent for amusement. "Think a little deeper, Keller," said Scar, his milky eyes piercing into Montgomery's. There was no love behind those. Montgomery thought hard. With his senses dulled, it was difficult to think quickly or draw upon Keller's memories. "Keller," came the voice in his ear, "you know Lady Wensongale well. You were engaged to her sister. Say it, Keller." I was engaged to her sister." As he said the words, a faint ghost of a human form filled his mind. A hefty set woman, usually seen wearing a military uniform just about everywhere except in formal social functions. Lady Wensongale. "Good," said Large Nose, sighing exasperatedly. "She'll be among the lords we'll be seated with." He nodded his head, and they navigated through the tables. Overhead lights dimmed a bit, emphasizing the glow coming from a set of tables near the head of the room, where the king of Greater Europa sat beside his retinue. He was not ostentatiously dressed as Montgomery half thought he might be, just wearing a fine white suit, a simple crown, and a trimmed red beard. He waved to his people. "Do you know what we're celebrating, Keller?" said Scar. It's a victory," Montgomery answered. He knew that much. The rest was fuzzy, stuck deep in the briars of his weakened mind. "A victory over?" prompted Large Nose, clearly concerned about this whole enterprise. "The Slav-Asian preeminence," he said quickly. "We beat them at the Battle of Sydney this past week." Large Nose let out a steady breath. "Yes, that's correct." "Well done, Keller." "What day?" asked Large Nose. But Scar waved a hand. "Never mind, he knows enough. Don't expect us to be able to help you as much as the man on the earpiece, Keller. But don't worry. These sorts of things are pretty rote." "Not rote to me," he thought. "Just be your usual charming self," said Scar, although there was a touch of irony in his tone. Montgomery nodded and flexed his fingers. "Charming, right. The man who's been routinely tortured for months on end." They approached a wide oval-shaped table, with every seat filled, or being filled, except for 3 all in a row. Montgomery took his seat in the center one, with Scar and Large Nose on either side of him. They sat and straightened their backs with the distinct appearance, to Montgomery at least, of men trying to pretend nothing was amiss. The others at the table probably wouldn't notice. They were bursting with joviality, chatting with one another non-stop. The chatter continued for a long moment. Montgomery didn't know what to do or say. He realized with a thudding weight of understanding that he had nothing whatsoever in common with any of these people. His military experience was separate, directly opposed to their efforts, and most memories of his time as a soldier were so distant in Montgomery's memory that it may as well have never happened. He was younger than nearly all of them. He didn't care about the things they cared about. And obviously the person they thought he was, by looking at him, wasn't truly him at all. But he also noticed that everyone was focused on everything but him. Maybe that was for the best. He locked gazes suddenly with a woman. Her short silver hair was in curls. A conservative leaf green and ebony dress garbed her thick but not overweight body. Her eyes were sullen and her mouth drawn to a line, only the faintest of lipstick and makeup applied to her face. This, Montgomery recognized through Keller's memories, was Lady Wentongale. Rosemary was her given name, but she went by Marie, pronounced with a broad A, less feminine sounding. She was on the other side of the table, diagonal from Montgomery, her hands cupped together on the tablecloth, and her pale blank face framed by 2 burning candelabras. I was engaged to her sister. In a flash, Montgomery thought he remembered more about this woman than he had been told by his handlers. "Ladies, gentlemen, and others," said someone with a voice booming on a microphone. Every head turned to look at an announcer woman in standard military garb at the head of the room on a platform not far from the king. The air of the room was vibrant, full, and lively. "We welcome each of you here today," she said with a tight-lipped smile and smug attitude. "The Australia District has been and remains our most important goal. Almost all our efforts are devoted to recovering it. This past week, we made a major stride toward that goal. King McLaughlin will have words of encouragement for us near the end of the evening. For now, with the King's goodwill, we begin the feast and invite you to celebrate a good day, a day of victory for Greater Europa, the finest empire that has ever existed. Together we stand against the barbarism and megalomania of the East and West. Together we shall push to a unified and meritorious world, a true utopia." The crowd erupted in cheers. Montgomery could hardly hear himself think. The headache seemed to worsen in all this noise as the whole place thundered with vibrations. "Applaud, damn you, applaud now," shouted the voice in his ear. He hadn't realized he wasn't clapping. He stood up, as some of the others at the table had done, slapped his palms together vigorously and repeatedly. "Denouncing megalomania as they speak of unifying the entire world through force. Get me off this mad, mad planet." The applause died, and the speaker woman gestured to 2 long lines of waiters and waitresses filing in through doors on either side of the room to deliver trays full of steaming hot foods to everyone. Another 2 rows of tray-bearing servers appeared at the opposite end of the room, coordinated as dancers. It wasn't long before trays full of turkey, gravy, ham, vegetables, bread, and sweets were set upon Montgomery's table, a meal for kings. He ate with vigor and joy at first, grateful beyond anything to eat real food, but realized upon the first bite that his sense of taste was tremendously dulled. Part of preventing him from suffering the pain of Keller's sickness. The food tasted terribly faint, as if it were drowned in water. He tried not to let crushing disappointment show in his face. Besides, why should he care about getting full? It wasn't his own body. Once he was out of the soul cage, he'd be back to his usual hungry self. A woman seated opposite him, hair piled atop her head like a prom queen and wearing the lowest cut dress Montgomery had ever laid eyes upon, leaned forward and grinned at him. "Mr. Keller," she said with an airy tone, "I had heard you weren't feeling terribly well today. What with your constant work at the Department of Technology lately, I can't say I'm surprised. I'm glad you managed to make it here anyway. A shame it would be to miss a gala like this." Montgomery froze. His eyes were stuck on this woman and her unfamiliar form. The way she acted, it terrified him. How she knew so much more than he, who bumbled about in a body he didn't even know. How she expected him to play along with the intricate culture of the military. How she expected him to smile and say something usual and approved and pleasant. She looked to him like one would an alien creature. Her smile slowly, ever so slowly, faded to a confused frown. Beside him, Scar and Large Nose peeked at him with worry. "Say something. Tell her thank you," said the man in his ear, baffled by his hesitation. "Thank you," was the first thing that came out of his mouth. He coughed, touching his fist to his lips, brushing against that mustache he kept forgetting he had. "I'm sorry," he went on desperately, trying to smile. "I am a bit under the weather, but nothing to be worried over. I had to come to celebrate with everyone else." He laughed and grinned, but it seemed that the put-off woman, as well as her presumed lover beside her, were mostly pacified. He'd salvaged things, barely. What could he say to them except for the few throwaway lines that came to his head? What could he possibly say to make them see him as Keller, the man they knew and liked? The voice in his head came to his rescue. "That's Lady Tunisia. You admire her work designing military uniforms and banners. Listen, Keller, chin up and repeat after me." He cleared his throat and planted his eyes upon the woman. With straightened back and chin up, he repeated, "Lady Tunisia, I have to say that I was floored by the new banner design for the infantry in Africa. Truly brilliant, brilliant work." Outside Montgomery was a smiling older man with a mustache and charming yet slightly bloated features. Inside he was a frightened man fearing intensely that he had said something wrong. Even though he had done and said exactly what the handler had told him, still piercing fear lurked deep, that she would reject his falseness. He was not whole, not like this. Even if she did warm up to him, he'd still not be whole. He wasn't Keller, after all. His facial hair and fine suit were a costume. Fake. Lady Tunisia, however, did not catch one line of Montgomery's inner dialogue. She didn't sense the rips and tears in his heart, the fear of torture and isolation. She simply leaned back in her chair, back straight, whole body grinning, all her exposed skin gleaming. Were those bits of sparkles in her pores, too? "Thank you, officer. You're very kind," she said with a mock-humble smile on her face. A tall, darker-skinned man with a goatee turned and acknowledged Montgomery. With a pleasant aura, he said, "Keller, how much longer till they promote you, you think?" "This man's name is Hector Pope," recalled Montgomery. "Well," he said, "I worked hard to get where I am. If we keep working hard, I expect we'll do all right." For some reason, that earned a few chuckles from the people listening to him. Quite a few. Keller wasn't a well-loved man amongst his colleagues. Feared and respected in a sense, but not loved. He realized that now, found the knowledge somewhat suppressed in Keller's head. He felt small as a pin, and fear jolted through every ligament and fiber in his body. Just picturing a small snapshot of the torture he would endure if he damaged Keller's reputation by his ineptitude here was enough to get his palms sweating. He searched deeper into Keller's mind for understanding, or tactics, or anything. In a sense, Keller had grown up with these people, but did he really know or care about any of them? Did they really know or care about him? Neither side knew the truth now, at any rate. They weren't talking to the real Keller. And Montgomery was afraid to get to know them, afraid to try. He was no actor. He couldn't play this role without making serious mistakes. In the corner of his eye, Lady Wensongale, Mari, was looking him over. He could feel her gaze like a pair of thick security guard hands patting him down, searching for anything at all that was out of the ordinary. He took a deep breath. The next command came. "Tell them about your hopes for the future of Greater Europa." Each of these people regarded him with such politeness, such friendliness, such formalized respect as per the nature of their organization. Montgomery clenched his teeth. If any of them knew who he truly was, if they knew who they were speaking to, they would shout out in fear or fury. They'd rip out his heart and tower over his collapsed, bleeding frame until they snuffed out his abominable life. Yes, they hated him, and they didn't even know it. Yet he was expected to speak amicably to them, pretend to be someone they did not hate, so they would never learn the truth. What choice did he have? The conversation stayed alive and well, without much input from him. One particularly faddish man spent minutes on end talking about the most vain and inane topics imaginable. He spoke to the table, not really to anyone in particular. He may as well have been alone, listening to his own echo. Montgomery disliked him instantly, and grew to despise him, and not much time at all. All told, however, these people did have a beauty to them, a truthfulness to their interactions that existed whether Montgomery thought them vain or not. It was more interaction than he ever got. Who is he to call them fake? As the evening wore on, people paid less and less attention to him. In a sense, it made him feel great relief, but also anxiety that perhaps he had indeed sullied Keller's reputation overall and would face the consequences later, back in this cell. He could only sit and fret about what might come. Dinner eaten, people mingled freely and tasted sugary sweets of all varieties on serving tables. Mari went off to speak to other people. Montgomery stayed seated, no interest in eating sweets when he was entirely numb to taste. He wiped food from his mustache and felt pangs of lingering disgust at being in another man's body. It was something most Soulcage users never quite got over. But only most. Montgomery recalled with repulsion how some Soulcage adept people, typically men, would pay to Soulcage into the body of someone of the opposite sex. The common cultural thinking was that it satisfied a healthy curiosity. But Montgomery didn't fall for that. It was nothing more than a satisfaction of perverse sexual desires, unnatural and depraved. The fact that the Soulcage allowed for such things was a mockery to nature and common decency. The hedonistic world at large didn't frown upon it, and it likely thought people like him were insufferable prudes, but he at least thought it the newest and most disturbing form of debauchery yet. Although borrowing the body of another man felt wrong in his mind, a part of him wanted it still, just so that he could feel. But the price of admission was too much. He would rather be himself, if only that were possible. Yet how could he hold fully to that conviction when being here, even in an uncomfortable body, was so exciting compared to being stuck in the cell or Soulcage in the body of a battle droid? However wrong he thought it all to be, it was infinitely more engaging than the day-to-day dreariness of his lonely life. Time to mingle, sighed Large Nose. Montgomery had forgotten the two handlers were sitting there, staring around and getting bored. They stood up and escorted him off. He understood. He had been sitting for a long time. They led him from group to group, having short conversations, from which he learned about the movements of troops and the confining of prisoners. Scar and Large Nose gave each other wary looks often, such that it seemed to become blatantly obvious to Montgomery that they were worried about him learning too much. Would Keller really be able to keep his promise to Montgomery? Did his superiors even know about the deal he had made? Montgomery got the sense that they didn't. When they inevitably discovered what was happening, would they revoke the privilege Keller had perhaps rashly and irresponsibly promised Montgomery and keep him in a Soulcage comatose anyway? That would make sense. With how much he now knew about Greater Europa's inner workings, which wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but may well have been just enough to incur them more risk than they were comfortable with taking, why not stick him in the Soulcage forever and be done with it? One tall and sweaty man with wavy hair told Montgomery how he looked forward to seeing Keller's new teams finish training. He had only the haziest ideas of what the man was talking about, and was glad when his earpiece gave him a way to bow out of the conversation. The whole building began to weigh upon him. Though the sickness was dulled, he felt that the myriad of voices and faces in this enormous place was sickness enough in and of itself. He rounded a pillar, his handlers standing further back from him so as to not give the impression that Keller was being babied, and came face to face with Mari sitting on a carven bench. She looked miserable as ever, but something lit up in her eyes upon seeing him. Oddly enough, Montgomery felt a negative magnetic force push upon his mind just at the sight of her. He couldn't believe what he was feeling. Keller was actually retracting from her gaze. Not Montgomery's soul-caged Keller, but the real Keller, who was locked in his own mind, sensing dully what was happening to his body. It was instantly obvious that Keller had deep aversions to speaking with Mari Wentengale. Montgomery surmised that deep relationship tension had come between them when Keller decided to pursue Mari's sister instead of her. That had only worsened after the sister died. Keller retracted deeper into his head. All throughout the dinner, Montgomery could faintly sense Keller there somewhere. Once Montgomery was out of his body, Keller would awaken with dreamlike memories of all that had been done in his mental absence. But no such phenomena was occurring at this moment. Keller purposefully, or perhaps even reflexively, went so far deep that Montgomery believed he was the only one whose senses picked up on this interaction with Mari, whatever it would prove to be. At any rate, it began, and there was no backing out now. "Adrian," she said numbly. Her voice rang like a sledgehammer on steel. Dimples appeared in the corners of her lips, although she gave only a faint half-hearted semblance of a smile. "Mari," he replied. He noticed that his handlers remained back. They knew to stay out of these conversations, evidently. "How was your evening?" she asked. Her eyes dipped down to the floor, where she was tracing a circle with her high-heeled shoe. "It's going fine," he answered. "Mari," he searched for the words to speak. What could heal this divide? I'm glad you're here." "Where else would I be?" she muttered. "We can't afford to miss these stupid things." Her eyes were on him again. He met the stare and forced himself not to break eye contact. "That's a good point." "You know they're saying they'll do another one in about 2 weeks." She shuddered. 2 bloody weeks, to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the founding of Greater Europa. A sigh punched out from her mouth. "I hope to God that's the last of them." "Me too," he replied, watching her with fascination. He knew Keller had his reasons for not wishing to speak with her, but Montgomery somehow thought her interesting. For whatever reason, he wanted to know what made her tick. Her stare sharpened, and she crossed her arms and softly, skeptically laughed. "What's your deal today? You haven't spoken to me for more than 30 seconds in months." I'm sorry, Mari." She swore at him, and his brows shot up. He began to understand why Keller wanted to stay away from her. "I want to make things right to you," he said. He wasn't sure where those words came from. They just felt authentic somehow. Her chin lifted up, and she laughed skeptically again, narrowing her gaze even further. "I doubt that very much." "I know we're both busy, but I think we can work this out." As he spoke, emotions and terrible feelings were coming back to him. The loss of his fiancée, the pain he'd seen in Mari's eyes as he chose Hilda over her, the confusion and bitterness that had followed them both in the wake of Hilda's death. He felt Keller's own guilt and the desire to put it behind him forever. Part of him wanted to run the opposite direction, but that wouldn't bring him anywhere. That only led closer to the Soulcage. "Will you try?" he asked. He cringed immediately after setting those words free, knowing they were poorly phrased. Well, Mari certainly jumped at the chance to tell him that. She literally jumped from the bench, fists clenched. I have been trying for months, you lunk-headed pissant. You, on the other hand, have kept busy snaking your way up the damned military hierarchy just to have something to do when you're bored of seducing members of my family. He cleared his throat and tried to stand tall and not betray weakness. It was hard with her standing close to him, sharp demeanor nearly puncturing his skin, like trying to hold in urine while she knelt on his bladder. I don't want to avoid you, he said, again knowing nothing but to tap into the well of genuine thoughts that streamed to his vocal cords. It's just difficult. This is difficult. She cocked her head. You were definitely not yourself tonight. He cleared his throat again. There was a long string of silence as she crossed her arms and scanned the room. The murmuring crowds began to die down as they scattered off to different rooms in the enormous building. If you're serious, then, she took a deep breath, growing calmer. Will you be at the party 2 weeks from now? Keller, said the voice in his ear, I don't believe you're going to be happy about saying yes to that. Will I be there? He said, asking the question to the handler, but sounding it like a confirming repetition of Mari's question. She pinned her eyes upon him, silent. Well, yes, you'll be there, but Keller does everything in his power to avoid things like this, conversations with her. I can tell this is important to you, Mari, said Montgomery, again speaking to two people at once. There was hurt in her eyes, something deeply hidden, even under all the surface-level unpleasantness. It wounded Montgomery, because he understood. It was the only thing amid all this nonsense, all this pomp he was being forced to take part in, that was real at all. The only thing that seemed like it even mattered. Of course I'll be there, he said. Once the words left his lips, however, his boldness melted. It was just another empty promise. He didn't have authority to promise such a thing. He wouldn't even be there. It would be the real Keller. The real Keller who would be furious with him. But, damn it, this felt right. There was no taking the words back now besides. He knew it was indeed right when Mari's eyes softened. They began to glisten, and she sniffed and straightened her posture. Well, I'm surprised at you, Adrian, she said. Still, she did not smile, but her ire had gone. She was relatively pleased with him. You are starting to behave like a man. He mustered a weak smile. I feel like it's the right thing to do. Another deep breath, and she moved a step closer to him. Her smell was so familiar, alarming and yet comfortable all at once. I'll see you then. Have a good night. After a slow, heavy nod, she walked past him without another look. Large Nose and Scar hustled to him and gripped his arms on either side. Idiot! Batty fool, they said. I know, he answered. I know. Large Nose licked his lips. Well, never mind. Let's get on with it. There are a few more people to see before the night is over, Mr. Keller. They pushed him off and led the way along, making him feel like a chastised dog. But in other ways he felt tied to Mari. He felt like a healing process had begun. Keller's consciousness started floating out of the deepness of his own mind, and Montgomery hoped the longing for healing would somehow seep through to him too. That's the end of Chapter 6.